dear. We can begin.
Okay, great. Good evening to everyone who's tuned in. Today, we're going to speak about the theme of rural distress, especially in the Indian context. And we are joined today by Professor A.R. Vasavi. Professor A.R. Vasavi is a social anthropologist based in Karnataka, India. She completed her master's from the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, and her PhD in social anthropology from Michigan State University, USA. Her academic interest lies in the sociology of India, agrarian studies, and sociology of education. She has conducted field research in various parts of India and is currently a member of the Punarchith Collective that works on alternative learning. A very, very warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Tia.
So, to start off with, I think what is important to in this theme, the first critical question that we encountered while reading your article for the EPW is you write on the industrialization of agriculture. You say that in reality, we've been locked on a treadmill of subsidized overproduction for over the last century. So, in what ways do you believe industrialization has affected agriculture across the globe? And could you share a few examples of the same?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to qualify that when I say industrialization, I don't equate it only with mechanization or use of technologies, which is typically what is done. We need to define industrialization of agriculture as use of machinery and technologies along with the norms and processes of industrialism. So in this context of agriculture, for example, right from the 1940s, the tractors and tillers, etc., were introduced. But more recently, what are called advanced industrial inputs, such as what are called fourth industrial inputs, for example, drones and computer-based technologies, sensor-based technologies using satellite, etc. All of these have also been introduced into agriculture. So across the world, what we see is industrialization has meant that not only is invasive and extractive technologies being used, for example, tractors or pitchforks used to clear land, based on the same process that industrialization is sort of driven. For example, the importance of productivity, the importance of speed, the importance of uniformity, and of course, higher profits has been the key goal with limited time. So, for example, what we've seen, and again, since the US was the pioneer in using high technologies, especially on a vast scale, and making agriculture industrialized, making more and more farms look like factories, you've had the case of how devastating it has been to ecology. The Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when millions of the Americans from Southern America fled into the cities, was a good example. But you've had this across the world where you've had excessive use of technologies. For example, the promotion of oil palm in Southeast Asia using high technologies has led to a lot of environmental degradation. So along with that, what you see is the importance given to productive that is using these kind of crops that took about 6 months to grow are now expedited by manipulating to make them grow faster. For example, the average wheat and rice, which used to take 6 months, now grows in 3.5 months. Some vegetables which would take 4 to 5 months are now being grown within something like 90 days. So it is that kind of principles of industrialization we are seeing. There is also creation of artificial conditions across. For example, the extent to which deep tube wells using machinery used to draw water, right, including from what are called aquifers. A lot of pumping out of water is done. This is especially true in arid areas where water sources are scarce. So all of these have meant that the impact of industrialization has not only been ecologically devastating across the countries. For example, much of Africa, what is, if you, what is happening in Africa, especially with agriculture, is not reported widely in popular media, but there are all these stories of large numbers of northern African peasants, people trying to head out towards Europe. But this is because there is so much distress in these rural situations. Vast spots of West Africa are now under both famine conditions, all triggered by the excessive and overuse of land, leading to not only loss of tree covers, leading to droughts. But so what we have are mass ecological refugees that are being created because of industrialization of agriculture. The most recent and very dramatic examples are also from South America, where the Amazon is being cut to extend commercial agriculture, for example, rubber, etc. So with this, what you see very significantly is a separation of agriculture from ecology. Earlier, you would have had agriculture made suitable to different types of ecologies, why a certain kind of wheat would be grown in some place, rice or sugarcane grown in wet areas, but in dry areas, you would have millets and peanuts, etc. All of this which are being defied by the use of technologies. So that is what we mean by industrialization. The other impact that we see because of industrialization is the whole package is also with not only machinery, but new knowledge systems, what kind of fertilizers, pesticides, seeds have to be used. It's an erosion of local knowledge systems. What was valid had evolved over centuries, in fact, just being displaced, and packaged knowledge, information, skills being put through with the machines. For example, if you take a hybrid seed, you also have to do the rest of the practices that go with it, put a particular kind of fertilizer in a particular way, use a particular kind of pesticide. We also have the case of large displacement of labor, which has been one of the most devastating impacts, which again leads to the migration that we are seeing. But three more important impacts of the industrialization of agriculture is the poisoning of our platter across the world. As you see, food quality has declined. You can no longer take food for granted. All kinds of pesticides have been in use. There's been genetic modification of grains. Therefore, those have also been harmful for individuals. For example, the spread of wheat intolerance, people who can't take what is called celiac disease, is mostly because wheat has been tampered with so much, and therefore you have a lot of illnesses associated with that. So along with that, literally the poisoning of our platters is the loss of local food cultures, where large numbers of people have switched from local, very ecologically specific, very culturally specific kinds of agricultures to commercial, industrial agriculture. We see shifts to non-local foods. For example, the loss of millets is now one of the things. But in South America, where they were growing chia, they've not been able to grow that. In much of it is being exported, etc. So it is in those areas where you see loss of food cultures, we see more and more malnutrition. So we have this paradox of now, huge surpluses that are being produced, but even if people are eating those surplus food, the basic nutrition needs are not being met. Finally, I want to say that industrial agriculture is very strongly associated with what are called zoonotic diseases. COVID was a very good example, as diseases that come because animals are being, put into these factory conditions where they are, not only wild animals, but even other domesticated animals that are kept in, factory-like conditions and expected to have high productivity, and then bombarded with certain kinds of chemicals and growth hormones, etc. And also the kind of conditions they are kept in is leading to diseases. So it's a whole panoply of problems that we see, not just emerging, but are fully now manifested across the world.
Absolutely. And some very, very salient points that you've raised through your first answer itself. I think that summarizes very well what happens when we disassociate agriculture from ecology, which is inherently interlinked. Um, so, what have been some of the key policies that have framed rural India?
Yeah. This is very important. One is to also recognize that although there have been policies, especially in the early years after independence, most recently there haven't been policies. There are lots of programs, and one needs to understand that also. But since independence, and in some ways, it was an extension of the British colonial policies also, agriculture and rural India were seen as their primary responsibility was to just produce food. It was food scarcity, the whole, Neo-malthusian thing of there's this huge population. So productivity and agriculture were then equated. So it meant three things. One is, first of all, there was an inversion by this excessive emphasis on just producing food, and the rural is equal to agriculture, making them synonymous, meant there was an inversion in the way which rural India was seen. I call this inversion because the deficits of rural India, the agrarian system especially, was overlooked, which is that it was based on the caste system. Overlooking that, and that whole system, that structure, the caste class coinciding structure was retained, whereas what was really positive, which is the diversity of agricultural practices and complexes across the country, from the Himalayas to the southern coastal belt, tremendous varieties which had evolved with very sophisticated knowledge, skills, practices, in which there was inbuilt sustainability, in which biodiversity was contained, and in which cultures that also evolved, those will have been sought to be erased. So along with this inversion, you have another thing, what I call a dualistic perspective, which is in promoting agriculture, the neglect of all rural industries. For example, we know one of the biggest sources of, apart from agriculture, the biggest livelihood source was weaving. And weaving of different types of cotton, different kinds of silk in different parts of India was also part of the rural economy. So with that, it was not just weaving, it was carpentry, basket making, smithy, house building, making medicines, a whole lot of other kinds of livelihood cottage industries that were once thriving, that had declined with the British system, colonialism, continued to be neglected in rural India, although the idea of khadi and handicrafts and cottage industry was there, they were not given importance at all. So along with this, finally, in extending it in the 1990s, along with neoliberalism, we've had another kind of addition to this inversion or what I call inverted policies, which is there is an economics of neglect, inadequate funding for rural India, not just agriculture, inadequate funding for health and education, very key public institutions that should have catered to the basic social needs of people, to the welfare needs. A very, very little amount going, that largely accounts for why we have nothing less than a skeleton system of our health system in rural India now. Little bit better is only elementary education, but after that, there is nothing else. So the rest of the kind of educational system completely absent for rural India, catering for rural citizens, also for rural India, is completely missing. Along with this economics of neglect, to address in some ways the economics of neglect is what I call the politics of rescue, which is primarily during election times. There are announcements of, say, moratorium on farmers' loans, access to funds. For example, now we've known since 2014 when amounts are just given to anyone who owns land, 2,000 rupees per month, or now 12,000 rupees, the Kisan Samman, etc. All of which were done primarily to address the fact that the state itself promotes for capitalists huge amounts of benefits in terms of facilitating accumulation by dispossession. Vast swaths of land, forests could be given, vast amounts of regions can be opened up for mining, etc., without taking into account the fact that they are, lived and, living villages or settlements in those areas. So to cater to those people, there are all these doles. We will give you 10 kgs of rice per month. we will give scholarship to your children, some very, very basic minimum, which is primarily during the election times. So it is this combination of economics of neglect, but a politics of rescue that has constituted rural India in very complex ways.
Right. So in your work, you also speak about the adverse integration of rural India into the mainstream Indian economy. So could you elaborate on this with reference to the changes post the Green Revolution phase?
Yeah. I can I describe or I rather define adverse integration as the integration of rural citizens into the major dominant capitalist economy in terms that are adverse or that go against their interests. There is an absorption of their labor, of their resources, and even the capital into the large systems, and much of it is happening at a great cost to them. I want to say that all of this it has intensified, especially since the 1990s and the Green Revolution. We don't have a post-Green Revolution phase. We have a now Green Revolution second phase, where it's entered into the drier areas, but also new technologies and new inputs are coming in. So in that context, what you see as the integration of rural citizens is the extent to which, by engaging with commercial capitalist agriculture, they are absorbed, they need the capital, for example, to buy those technologies, to buy the inputs, but the capital is never assured. Then the market is never on their terms, which is why farmers constantly are on demands for their minimum support prices. As you must have read since yesterday in Maharashtra, there's a massive mobilization against the crash of onion prices, asking for support prices, etc. So strong dependence on the market and therefore on the state also. But an expropriation of their labor, we know that in so many regions, vast numbers leave their provenance, their settlements to work elsewhere in rural, semi, or in other rural areas, for example, from dry belts, people who go into the wet belts, going into urban areas, into the low-end urban informal economy, into the construction sites, which has been one of the most big absorbers of labor since the 2 decades, but without the guarantees, without securities. So when they fall ill, or if they have accidents, or when they retire, when they grow old, they come back to the village, which is why our migration is primarily circular migration. So there's an absorption of labor without adequate security and support. We also see that there are rural India citizens are being integrated on what I call the techno-financial regime, which is Aadhaar, GST, the new kind of banking systems, the mobile-based banking system, etc. All of which are ways in which there is increased surveillance of rural citizens. For example, recently data shows that many women, especially women from disadvantaged families who are in MNREGA, the Rural Employment Program, the new policy has been that their attendance and work is being monitored through smartphones, and everybody's expected to have a smartphone. And all the women who didn't have those smartphones have actually dropped out of the system. So there is a violation of the right to work because of the use of some of these technologies. So an integration and those are technologies of surveillance, of administration that are being deployed against them. Finally, there are also more and more what we see in rural India is this contradiction of the expansion of the media, not only television becoming popular, but also through the mobile phones, again, social media becoming very popular. It's become, the media has become the key source of consumerism, or the exposure to new forms of consumerism. So that retail boom that you also see in rural areas is linked to that. But it has then also encouraged a kind of consumerist culture. So they are also trapped into circuits of not only consumerism, but a sort of exhibitionism, which then become adverse to the interest. For example, the increasing dowry rates, the types of dowries that are being demanded, all of which are linked to increasing consumerism. So overall, this is what I mean by adverse integration of rural India into the dominant economy.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to know if you think that there's been an adverse integration with special respect to the gender or the caste aspects as well. And, how have they
Mhm.
been integrated into the overall Indian economy
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
agriculture?
Caste, of course, because caste so closely coincides with class. The ones, the upper caste, or even the landed in the rural case, more than just the upper caste as Brahmin Kshatriyas, it's the dominant caste, those who have access to land and capital and political power, who actually benefited from integration. So that it's not adverse to them at all. To those who it has been most adverse are small and marginal farmers who have got integrated, but not on terms that are suitable or advantageous to them. And therefore they face all this, losing land, getting into debt, and selling land, etc., or being forced out to migrate.
Mm-hmm.
With women, it is much more complex because there are very contradictory trends where there is a little bit of economic mobility. There's what is called the empowerment of women, women who are withhold from labor. They no longer work in the fields but are expected to stay back. Or if they're educated, even girls who just make it to high school, etc., are seen as not fit to be doing manual work, but they're kept at home. But what you see is also the contradiction where the demand for increasing income, you need more and more money in the house to satisfy not only basic needs, which where education has now become basic. It wasn't even just a few decades ago. To
Mm-hmm.
send your children to school or to send your child even for higher ed, etc., you need more money. And the idea that children will also be employed in non-agricultural work, which is a big, big thing. Everybody's busy trying to push their children out into non-agricultural employment. But in that case, even when girls are sent out, they bear the burden of having to study, to be educated, to study, do well, get jobs, but subscribe to old customary norms of the family or the caste. Which is why you see the whole how the system, why the family has become such a site of contestation and violence, where when young people who go out to study or who are employed in small towns and cities want to choose partners of their own, and they may not be in their jatis of, and the family then comes down. Why we are seeing cases of honor killing across India only because young people want to have interjati or intercaste marriages. So I think this is also a way in which uh, Indian society has not been able to negotiate. This is a very, very cultural issue where you have only a partial subscription to the advantages of modernity, but not complete subscription. You don't allow individual freedom in this case.
Absolutely. Um, so, this also brings us to an important aspect of what we were talking about. In this context, how do we then approach the complex challenge of farmer suicides in the country? Statistically speaking, if we were to take the NCRB data as a basis, it shows that the incidence of farmer suicides has remained high in the 6 years between 2014 and 2020.
Yeah. Yeah, one is first of all, the data is does not really capture the reality. There's a lot of underreporting, and the NCRB since 2014 redefined what they meant by farmer suicide, and therefore large numbers are not being recorded at all. So it is much more than what it indicates. One of the first things I think to understand about farmer suicide is to see it not as a purely psychological issue. I
Hmm.
don't rule out the fact that there are psychological factors that play in, for example, going into depression or feeling a complete sense of loss, etc. But it is the overall situation of agriculture that is placing such a distress and large numbers of marginal and small farmers. And farmers generally, they have also been large farmers who own large parcels of land who've committed suicide. So the factors are, which I've kind of elaborated in my book and elsewhere, is because one has land holding sizes have collapsed, and there is this whole onus of being into commercial agriculture. Farmers have subscribed to this commercial model in which they need a whole load of external inputs. So in which case they need capital to buy not only these inputs, but capital is not easily available. So, they're getting into debt, especially non-institutional, that's non-banking debts, which are from money lenders, very high exorbitant rates. The other is that kind of agriculture that they're taking to is marked with what I have called as a web of risks. There's risk of not only where you get your capital, but what technology you use, whether seeds are spurious or not, or good seeds, how good is the climate, given climate change and all the vagaries of weather, they bear that also. Then the market, for example, now you can have boom crops and so many crops you're actually producing huge amounts, but because there is a surplus, the market prices crash, as you've seen now in onions that is going on. So market, capital, climate, production, all of these become risks for farmers, and therefore we've seen the extent to which in each of these loss of crops or inability to pay their debts, or the whole loss of land, etc., has triggered lots of desperation, and therefore there is suicide. The two other much more sociological factors is in this kind of agriculture, what accounts for suicide is that along with commercialization of agriculture, we have what I call individualization of agriculture. That most commercial farmers take to it on a very individualized basis, breaking away from the larger family, from the caste structure, or even from the village. The access is usually the agribusiness agent, the person who's selling them these inputs in the local town or the city. These people who are coming out and promoting, say, grow grapes this way, grow pomegranates, or grow whatever the new kind of whatever vegetable or fruits are in demand in the market, or new kinds of cotton that you could grow very easily. So we do that. They not only bear the burdens of high risks become much more heavy when it is borne individually, but also in times of crisis, they really have no outlet. It's not a shared risk. For example, earlier, if there was a drought, there was a flood, everyone would be affected the same way. But here it's completely individualized.
Yeah, more communitarian perhaps earlier.
Yes. Yeah. So therefore, it becomes very difficult for them to bear. And also there's the opting out. There are no options for many of these farmers to opt out. For anyone, of course, there are those who just say, okay, now I'm not going to cultivate anymore. I'll just become a landless laborer. That's why we are seeing large proportion of very small holdings are now not being cultivated at all, because it's more economically viable for them to just go and sell their labor rather than actually cultivate the land. But for those who are, slightly higher up, who had long histories, who come from landed households, it's a matter of shame not to cultivate your land and where you can't sell it also. So therefore, this resort to suicides. So overall, I see suicides not as primarily a psychological factor, but as a result of the very deficits that we see in the agrarian system in India, and as also the basis of which the whole structure, the whole livelihood system itself is in great distress.
Absolutely. And to add to that, I think climate change only makes things more complex or more uncertain, because with climate change, we're increasingly seeing in India and elsewhere the rise of extreme weather events, which means we don't know for certain whether a crop will be successful. So in I think crop insurance and farmers' security and some sort of backup for them becomes very essential for the state to take up actively.
Yes, yeah.
And so you also talk about Neo-malthusianism. So in what ways do you think that policy frameworks surrounding agriculture hint of Neo-malthusianism?
Yeah, this is all policies, both at the national level and at the center. For example, if you see all the vision documents for agriculture and vision documents for state planning, or at Niti Aayog, they always invoke this image of large numbers, this huge population, 1.3 billion, which is going to increase. 2050 will be so many mouths to feed, etc. That is always invoked. Second is also the idea that we still have a large number of people who are malnourished, and there is child stunting. So many percentage of children are stunted, etc. That is invoked without looking at reasons as to why that is so. But mostly all these are done in the context of promoting new, chemicalized, industrialized inputs, primarily being promoted by agribusiness agencies. But also these are ways in which the state does not want to take alternative approaches, that these are seen as quick fixes and that it is too risky to, uh, fidget around with what is called food security. And therefore, food security can only be assured by industrialized, chemicalized agriculture and nothing else. So this has
Right.
been a way of legitimizing this thing. And of course, threats of famine. For example, when any alternatives are spoken about, they will say, oh, do you then want to reduce, say, in the context of India, to that of Africa? So we had this examples last year when Sri Lanka was going through its crisis, which it still continues. One of the ways in which they thought they could save on foreign exchange was to not import fertilizers. So
Okay.
that is why they halted that, and they said it was like a second thought to say, oh, we are going to do organic agriculture, that's better. But actually, it was mostly to that, and you saw devastation. The food production declined. It was a poorly thought out, unfazed kind of decision that also led to the food crisis. So it's examples like that that are touted by saying any kind of shift away from this path could then lead you towards famine and starvation, and therefore it's best to stick to this model. And as the book that I reviewed, Stone's book, clearly elaborates on how this is used at all levels by not only policymakers and the agribusiness agencies, but also by state players themselves, to whom there is vested interest in keeping the larger system going. You saw this in the extent to which when farmers went on this long, nearly year-long strike or movement against the three farm bills, the three farm acts, especially the Punjab farmers, the people who are criticizing them said, oh, they don't understand that if they don't do all this, there will impending hunger and famine is at our doorstep. So Neo-malthusianism is invoked constantly. It's a ruse to sustain the industrial chemical agriculture.
Absolutely. So finally, my last question would be that how do you believe that dilemma of how to feed the world can be resolved in an equitable manner?
Yeah, I think one needs to go back to what we were talking about. What have been the parameters of policies? So one is how has rural India, not just agriculture. I want to reiterate that it's very important to see agriculture as part of rural India with other livelihoods. To see it as a viable economy, no longer to be seen as redundant, as the inevitability of a Lewisian transition, that large numbers must be shifted out to urban industrial areas. That's the only way to have livelihoods. That's the only way in which GDP will grow, etc. We know that new theories, for example, degrowth, etc., indicate that this kind of thinking no longer holds, that there are alternative ways to think about not only rural industrial, but also the urban rural divides need to be rethought. That's one of the things to see the rural as viable. Second is to primarily go beyond the productivity parameter. That this whole emphasis on productivity has now become counterproductive. We are seeing why. You can produce huge amounts at great ecological cost and at economic cost. And therefore, be devastating for the cultivators and also for the larger economy. So what then can be the new parameters should be for agriculture and for rural industry, if you have this holistic thing, is it should be ecologically sustainable, it should be socially just, who gets it, for example, who gets land, who gets to be part of it, and economically stable. You cannot have it going through periods of boom and bust. 1 year you can grow, whatever, grapes, or you can grow chia, which a superfood, and then that becomes, there is overproduction and the prices then collapse, which we had, when, for example, when vanilla was being promoted across India. Instead of this adverse integration, what overall can be the focus is a decentralized consolidation, decentralized rural economies to habitat levels, recognizing ecological specificities, recognize knowledge systems, recognize skills that are available in these rural areas, and start new production centers, which not only there is cultivation thing, but there is processing. For example, so much of food processing in India takes place in the cities. Whether it is the Annapurna atta, made in thing, it's sent to the factories, etc., into large factories, from thousands of miles they would, truck it out. Things like a lot. You see processing of all the grains that are happening in the towns and in the cities, not in rural areas at all. Rural areas are seen only as actually producing from the land. So therefore, delinking the rural from the profits which actually accrue to their own products. So what you have is farmers are producing crops, all kinds of products. For example, it could be non-food crops also. But the profits are going to the processors, those who do the value addition, to the merchants, to the traders, and to the agribusiness agencies. And finally, of course, on the whole chain of other restaurants, others, but not really to the farmers at all. So if you want to break that, we also have to see the rural has not only a site of this original production, but also of the value addition and new structures in which, for example, farmer producer organizations which are now starting off with group farming that is starting off, much of the profits should really remain with the farmers, which some of the new alternative groups are trying to do that, saying that at least 60% of the total end cost of a product should actually go to the producer, to the farmer herself or himself. So I think a new kind of economics is required, but more specifically, new kinds of production centers need to be set up. Two other issues are that when we talk about the rural, and it's very inadequate to stop at the level of new economies or new production units. The rural desperately needs key public institutions, which should be very good, high quality health, education systems, along with decentralized administration. For example, the Panchayat Raj system for good governance, with high accountability. Currently, there isn't that, and much of those have been, the potential itself has been erased so substantially. And to come to this idea of food security, it is to see that food security and sovereignty can only be built on larger policies in which there is an upholding of the principles of democracy, that it should be. Right now, policies are being completely made behind closed doors. There is no sharing. Although agriculture is a state subject, you've seen how the 3 farm bills are made at the center and then sort of be promoted in the states. Worse still, agribusiness agencies and philanthropic foundations that have vested interests. For example, the GATE foundations being implicated in agriculture policies in India. The fortification of food, introduction of GM seeds, or big agribusiness groups, all of which are done on behind closed doors and then promulgated to people without consultation. So democratizing rural, all economic issues, primarily rural, not to shut rural. They have very good ideas, and therefore, if you democratize it, you also need to decentralize it. The average farmer in Punjab may have a different kind of imaginary, what they would want to. A farmer in Tamil Nadu would want to have a different way of not only producing food, but a different kind of economy itself, and a different structure that is required. Therefore, highlighting and sustaining diversities of things. So if you have diversities of production system, you also have diversities of cultures and society, which really is the bedrock of our democratic systems. In a context where, everything is becoming monocultural and mono-religious, etc., we need to really re-emphasize the fact that the diversity of our cultures were based on the diversity of agricultural and ecological systems also, and knowledge systems. And that would be important. And finally, the dignity, the rights of rural citizens to decide these factors and to have a kind of dignified life, which I think all these policies so far erode, they challenge that, which accounts for why rural India, almost 3 decades now, starting from 1997, when the first wave of agrarian suicides were recorded, to now, you see rural India being placed into a basket case, something that is hopeless, that needs to be changed, and therefore distress itself being its key marker.
Absolutely. So beautifully put by you, ma'am. So to summarize, there's a need for ecologically sustainable, economically viable, and more diversified production systems. And we need an agricultural framework which supports inclusion, which supports decentralization of policies and consensus building, and that cannot happen behind closed doors. We need a larger integration of the rural with our policymakers. So thank you so much again to all for viewing the session. And a professor's article is very much there on our website. You can go and have a look if you'd like to read it. And we'd also request you to please subscribe to EPW and follow us on social media. Thank you so much again, Professor, for all your valuable insights.
Thank you. Bye.